On the morning of 16 November 1983, in Flint, Michigan, a 16-year-old schoolgirl left her home on Seneca Street, beginning the familiar journey she had made every day for the previous 2 years. Walking to the bus stop at the intersection of West Dartmouth Avenue and Clio Road, it was 6:30 a.m. The eastern sky was only just bright enough to reveal the outlines of the cars parked along the street. A car pulled up beside her just a few houses from her front door. Before she reached the corner, no one on that street witnessed what happened next. That morning, her seat in first period at Carmen High School was left empty forever. 4 days later, her body was found in a roadside drainage ditch along a rural road 30 miles north of Flint. She had endured a brutal attack before her life was taken by 4 gunshots. A single spent cartridge casing lay beside her body, the only piece of physical evidence left at the scene. But the detail that sent a chill through investigators did not come from the crime scene. It came from the post-mortem examination. The teenage girl had remained alive for as long as 3 days after she disappeared. The biological evidence recovered from her body pointed directly to the person who had taken her. But in 1983, not a single laboratory in the world had the capability to read it. That sample lay untouched in evidence storage for decades, waiting for a technology that no one at the time could possibly have imagined. It would take 43 years before the answer finally emerged, but in a way that no one, not even the most experienced detectives, could ever have anticipated. Who was the person who took the life of that 16-year-old girl? And what caused the answer to emerge only at the very moment when there was no longer anyone left to face it? Join me as we retrace the entire journey of this haunting case, spanning nearly half a century. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next case. Sherry Jo Elliott was born on 27 March 1967 in Charlotte, Michigan, the only daughter of Joyce Schultz. She grew up in a house on Seneca Street, on the west side of Flint, with her mother and stepfather, Robert. Her biological father, Harland Elliott, did not live with the family. In the early 1980s, Flint was still one of America's busiest automotive manufacturing centers, where General Motors plants provided work for tens of thousands of families. The west side of the city, where Sherry Jo lived, was a modest residential community of humble homes, small front yards, and aging driveways that reflected years of everyday life. After starting at Carmen High School, Sherry Jo settled into a steady routine. Every weekday morning, she walked from home to the bus stop at the intersection of West Dartmouth Avenue and Clio Road. It was a route she had traveled for 2 years straight, a journey so familiar that it had become an inseparable part of her daily life. Not far away, on Harry Street in the northern part of Flint, lived a man named Ronnie Collins. 17 years older than Sherry Jo, he was known in the local music scene as a well-regarded bass guitarist who regularly performed at bars around Flint and the surrounding area. To those who watched him play on weekend nights, he appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary local musician, someone who attracted little attention. These two people, a high school student and a local musician, lived only a few miles apart, with no known connection between them, until the fateful morning that was about to change everything. For a 16-year-old schoolgirl like Sherry Jo, everyday life revolved around simple routines, attending classes, spending quiet evenings with her family, and walking the familiar route to the bus stop each morning. It was the kind of steady routine she had repeated hundreds of times, becoming second nature, one that no longer required her to think twice or remain on guard. By the autumn of 1983, the colder days of the American Midwest were beginning to set in. Sunrise came later, the mornings grew colder, but Sherry Jo's routine never changed. She still woke up on time, packed her school books, and left the house at the same time every morning as she had for the previous 2 years, regardless of the weather outside. For Joyce and Robert, this was a peaceful period in their lives, with nothing to suggest that anything was about to change. Sherry Jo was a responsible young girl who kept to a regular routine, and she had never given her parents any reason to worry about her walking alone in the early morning, because the neighborhood they lived in had always been considered safe. Meanwhile, on the north side of the city, Ronnie Collins was living a life of his own weekend performances. Late nights playing music in local bars, a world completely separate from that of a teenage schoolgirl with whom he had no known connection during that time. No one living those two parallel lives could have imagined that, in just a matter of weeks, their paths would cross in the most brutal way imaginable, leaving the city of Flint to confront one of the most haunting criminal cases in its history. The morning of Wednesday, 16 November 1983, began like any other ordinary morning in Sherry Jo's life. She woke up on time, gathered her school books, and prepared for another day at Carmen High School. There was nothing to distinguish that morning from the hundreds that had come before it. At around 6:30 a.m., Sherry Jo left her home on Seneca Street and began her familiar walk to the bus stop at the intersection of West Dartmouth Avenue and Clio Road. The eastern sky was only just beginning to brighten, revealing the faint outlines of cars parked along the street. It was that quiet moment between night and day, when most of the neighborhood was still asleep and few people had yet stepped outside. Nothing suggests that Sherry Jo felt anxious or uneasy that morning. She had walked the same route countless times over the previous 2 years, a short journey of only a few blocks that seemed too familiar to pose any danger to a teenage girl who knew every corner of the neighborhood. But that morning, Sherry Jo never made it to the corner where the bus stop was waiting. The short distance between her front door and that familiar meeting point, normally only a few minutes on foot, became the final boundary between the ordinary life of a high school student and a tragedy that would haunt the city of Flint for decades to come. That morning, Sherry Jo's usual seat in her first class at Carmen High School was left empty forever. No one in that classroom could have known that it would be the last unusual thing they noticed before the full horror of what had happened slowly began to emerge in the days that followed. A car pulled up beside Sherry Jo, in the short stretch between her front door and the corner where the bus stop waited. In just a matter of seconds, the time it takes for a car to pull over a 16-year-old girl vanished from a road she had walked hundreds of times, and no one on the street realized what had just happened. It happened so quickly that it left no immediately visible trace, no loud commotion, no cries for help that anyone could hear, and no witness standing close enough to recognize the moment that changed everything. What made the case even more disturbing than investigators had first imagined was revealed only days later through the post-mortem examination. Sherry Jo had not been killed that morning. She remained alive until 19 November, meaning that for 3 days she was held somewhere secluded enough that no one heard her, no one saw her, and no one made a call to police. Those 3 days remain a complete void. No one knows what Sherry Jo endured, where she was held, or how many times hope gave way to despair during her captivity. The location where she was confined, whether a basement, a shed, or some other enclosed space within driving distance of Flint, has never been identified, and may forever remain a secret known only to one person. On the final day, Sherry Jo's life was taken by 4 shots, fired from a small caliber handgun. Her body was then transported to a rural roadside far from the city, as though the person responsible had carefully planned every step to ensure that no one could ever trace the path back to the place where she had been held during those 3 missing days. On the afternoon of 16 November 1983, when Sherry Jo failed to return home after school as she always did, Joyce began to fear that something was seriously wrong. She contacted the Flint Police Department, setting in motion a search that would continue for the next 4 days, involving both her family and law enforcement officers. Throughout those days, police searched the routes Sherry Jo was believed to have taken, while family members and friends put up missing person posters across the neighborhood, hoping someone had seen her or knew where she might be. Despite every effort, the search produced no meaningful leads during those first 4 days. On the morning of Sunday, 20 November 1983, a man checking muskrat traps along Miller Road in Blumfield Township, Saginaw County, about 30 miles north of Flint, noticed something unusual in a roadside drainage ditch. Only the day before, while checking the same traps, he had passed the very same stretch of road, and the ditch had been completely empty. Now, Sherry Jo's body lay there. The man immediately stopped what he was doing and contacted the local authorities. Within a short time, the information reached investigators in Flint, where Joyce and the rest of the family had spent 4 agonizing days waiting for news, clinging to hope only to have it fade again and again. For a quiet rural community like Blumfield, where serious crimes were virtually unheard of, the discovery came as a profound shock not only to the man who found the body, but also to the residents who lived nearby. The image of a young girl's body suddenly appearing beside a road they traveled every day left a lasting impression on everyone connected to the scene. News of Sherry Jo's death quickly spread back to Flint, bringing the family's desperate 4-day search to a heartbreaking end. At the same time, it marked the beginning of an investigation that would span nearly half a century, leaving many questions unanswered for decades to come. As soon as the report came in, local police officers and forensic investigators quickly arrived at the scene along Miller Road. Their first priority was to secure the entire area surrounding the drainage ditch, establishing a perimeter to prevent anyone, including curious onlookers and members of the media, from entering before the examination of the scene was complete. Within minutes of their initial assessment, investigators realized they were not dealing with an accidental or unexplained death. The condition of the body clearly indicated that Sherry Jo had been the victim of a violent assault. Nearby, just a few steps from where she lay, officers recovered a single spent cartridge case, evidence that she had been shot with a small caliber firearm. Before disturbing anything, the forensic team photographed the entire scene in detail. They then began collecting every piece of physical evidence they could locate, no matter how small. Particular attention was given to the victim's clothing, where biological material was recovered that would later become the single most significant piece of physical evidence in the entire investigation. Investigators also recognized another crucial detail almost immediately. The location where Sherry Joe's body was discovered was approximately 30 miles from where she had last been seen alive. That distance made it clear the crime had not occurred at the recovery site alone, but was the result of a deliberate sequence of events involving transportation over a considerable distance. Every item of evidence was carefully sealed, packaged, labeled and preserved in accordance with established evidence handling procedures before being transported to the laboratory for analysis. Yet in 1983, forensic science was still in its infancy. Although investigators possessed an invaluable biological sample, the technology simply did not exist to identify the person who had left it behind. In the weeks following the discovery of the crime, the Flint Police Department, working alongside the Michigan State Police, launched a large-scale investigation. Detectives thoroughly searched the area surrounding Sherry Joe's home, interviewed classmates and teachers at Carmen High School, and tried to identify anyone who might have been connected to the case or witnessed anything unusual on the morning she disappeared. Following standard investigative procedure, her stepfather, Robert, was among the first people detectives examined closely. After his movements and background were carefully verified, however, he was quickly eliminated as a suspect and remained a source of support for Joyce throughout the difficult years that followed. The investigation then expanded across the region, focusing on individuals with histories of sexual violence in Genesee and Saginaw counties, the two areas directly connected to where Sherry Joe disappeared and where her body was later found. Numerous names were investigated, compared against the available evidence, and ultimately ruled out because there was insufficient evidence to link them to the crime. Despite the considerable resources devoted to the investigation, detectives were unable to develop evidence strong enough to charge anyone. As the years passed, the case gradually reached a dead end, becoming one of the longest-running cold cases in the Flint area. Generation after generation of investigators inherited the file, reviewed every detail, and eventually had to set it aside when no new leads emerged. For decades, the case file was carefully preserved and periodically re-examined whenever advances in forensic science became available. Yet no significant breakthrough followed until forensic technology entered an entirely new era, making it possible to analyze biological evidence that had remained untouched for more than 4 decades. By late 2025, after months of building an extensive family tree through investigative genetic genealogy, detectives had finally identified a specific individual, a 75-year-old man living in Grand Blanc, about 10 miles south of Flint. Their next step was straightforward: approach him, request a voluntary DNA sample for comparison, and, if he refused, apply for a court order to obtain the sample through the normal legal process. That plan, however, never had the chance to be carried out. In January 2026, before any investigator had the opportunity to knock on his door, the man died by suicide at his home in Grand Blanc. He left behind no explanation, no note referring to 1983, and no indication of whether he knew investigators were about to contact him, or whether his death was simply a tragic coincidence in timing that no one could ever fully explain. His death forced detectives to change their approach, but it did not bring the investigation to an end. During the post-mortem examination, the medical examiner collected a buccal swab from his body, a routine procedure performed in all cases involving an unusual or unattended death, regardless of the cause. The sample was then submitted to the Michigan State Police Forensic Science Division, where forensic analysts conducted a direct comparison with the DNA profile developed from the biological evidence collected at the 1983 crime scene, a profile that had remained in storage for more than 4 decades, waiting for the opportunity to be matched. The results left no room for doubt. The 2 DNA profiles were a complete match, resolving the greatest mystery of the entire case, though in a way that no one, not even the most experienced investigators, could ever have anticipated. In most criminal cases, this is the stage the public waits for most: the moment a suspect sits across from investigators, when difficult questions are asked and statements begin to reveal the truth behind the crime. It is the point at which people witness the psychological battle between detectives determined to uncover the truth and a suspect determined to avoid it. But in Sherry Joe Elliott's case, that crucial stage never had the chance to unfold. The man's death in January 2026 permanently took away investigators' opportunity to sit across from him and ask the questions Sherry Joe's family had waited 43 years to hear answered. Why Sherry Joe? Where had she been held during those 3 agonizing days? Did he ever feel remorse? Or did he simply carry on with an ordinary life for more than 4 decades, living quietly within the community and even becoming known and well-liked by many through his weekend performances as a local musician. No interview ever took place. Detectives never had the opportunity to employ the psychological strategies that often shape major investigations. There was no carefully managed questioning, no gradual presentation of evidence designed to confront a suspect with the facts, and no moment of denial followed by confession. The kind of scene so often associated with cases that ultimately end before a jury. What remained instead was absolute silence, one that no investigative technique could ever break. The man took every answer with him, leaving behind no explanation for what happened in November 1983, and no indication of why he chose to end his own life at that particular moment. For Sherry Joe's family, this may be the most painful part of a journey that lasted nearly half a century. Although the identity of the person responsible has now been established with certainty, the answer to the question why is one they will almost certainly never hear. On 13 April 2026, the Michigan State Police held an official press conference announcing that the person responsible for the murder of Sherry Joe Elliott had finally been identified. Investigators named Ronnie Collins, born 9 February 1950, who had once lived on Harry Street in North Flint, only a short distance from the neighborhood where Sherry Joe had grown up. The conclusion rested on one decisive piece of evidence, a direct DNA comparison between a buccal swab collected following Collins' death and the genetic profile developed from biological evidence recovered during the 1983 investigation. To ensure complete scientific confidence before making the announcement, investigators submitted the findings to a second, independent forensic laboratory for verification. Both analyses reached the same unmistakable conclusion. Authorities also publicly acknowledged the contribution of a team of students from Western Michigan University, who had spent months digitizing and reorganizing thousands of pages of investigative records dating back to 1983. Their painstaking work laid the foundation for the genetic genealogy investigation, allowing detectives to trace family connections more efficiently and accurately. Investigators further revealed that Collins had previously been listed as a person of interest, though never charged in the 1969 disappearance of two teenage girls, Pam Hobley and Patricia Spencer, who vanished in Oscoda, Michigan. More than half a century later, their bodies have still never been found, leaving that case an enduring mystery. With the DNA evidence independently verified on two separate occasions, investigators concluded that the murder of Sherry Joe Elliott had finally been solved after 43 years, although not in the way anyone had ever expected. In the way we usually imagine a case reaching its conclusion, this should have been the most dramatic chapter of all. The courtroom lights, the prosecutor presenting each piece of evidence before the jury, the defense fighting to challenge every allegation, and finally the judge delivering the verdict. It was the moment Sherry Joe's family had waited 43 long years to see, but that chapter will never be written. Because Ronnie Collins chose to end his own life before investigators could approach him, no formal criminal charges were ever filed. No prosecutor ever stood before a jury to present the events of that November day in 1983. No defense lawyer was ever required to challenge the overwhelming scientific evidence, and most importantly, no sentence, whether life imprisonment or any other punishment, was ever handed down. Under the American legal system, the case was classified as exceptionally cleared. This means investigators identified the offender and had sufficient evidence to support a prosecution. But the prosecution could not proceed for reasons beyond law enforcement's control in this case, because the suspect had died. It is a legally precise classification, yet one that can never fill the void Sherry Joe's family has carried for the rest of their lives. In the end, justice reached only as far as identifying the man responsible. It could never continue to a courtroom, a trial, or a sentence proportionate to what Sherry Joe's family endured during nearly half a century of waiting. Joyce Schultz finally received the answer in the spring of 2026, more than 4 decades after losing her only daughter. Robert, the husband who had faithfully visited the police station year after year, hoping for any news about the investigation, had passed away just 8 months earlier, never living long enough to hear the answer he had spent a lifetime waiting for. When Joyce rang her sister, Judy Siaker, with the news, her first reaction was disbelief. She thought it had to be some kind of cruel joke. After 43 years of living with unanswered questions, believing that the truth had finally been uncovered was somehow harder than accepting another year of silence. For Sherry Joe's family, the answer arrived too late to ever feel complete. Too late even for the stepfather who had devoted the rest of his life to searching for it. The case of Sherry Joe Elliott is a heartbreaking reminder that justice sometimes arrives too late to ever be truly complete. Although investigative genetic genealogy ultimately identified the man responsible after 43 years, the death of Ronnie Collins permanently erased the possibility of a trial, a confession, or any form of full legal accountability. Sherry Joe's family finally received the answer they had waited decades to hear, but they were denied the complete measure of justice that a courtroom might have delivered. This story also leaves behind a powerful lesson for anyone still living with unanswered questions. Never stop speaking up, and never allow the passage of time to convince others that a case has been forgotten. Robert Schultz's unwavering determination returning to the police station year after year in search of updates stands as proof that memory and persistence can keep a case alive until science is finally capable of revealing the truth. It is also a reminder that, while modern forensic science can bridge the distance of decades, there are some losses that no investigative breakthrough, no matter how definitive, can ever truly make whole.